Thanks, Kirby. Welcome, everyone. I just wanted to thank a few people before I begin. The first person I want to thank is Gordon Bennett. Gordon turned me on to this story of Forrest Anderson back in 2007. I did an oral history with Gordon, and he said, well, you got to go talk to Duke Crowley. So I went over to Missoula to talk to Duke. I also did an interview with Alec Hansen. I did an interview with Rich Bechtel, who's here tonight, who worked on the Constitutional Convention. I did an interview with Sheena Wilson and with Newell Anderson, who's here tonight as well. And I also wanted to thank Ellie Argenbaugh, who retired about a year ago from the archives here. Ellie organized all of Forrest's papers and made my job a lot easier. And then finally, I wanted to thank Bonnie Bowler, who couldn't be here tonight, but let me borrow her Forrest Anderson campaign pin. So, with the nation in turmoil and at war in Vietnam in 1968, the state of Montana ended 16 years of Republican rule and elected political veteran Forrest Anderson to the governor's office. In the 20th century, Democrat Forrest Anderson stands out as one of the most politically experienced and adept ever to preside over the Capitol, and perhaps one of Montana's most transformational governors. In 4 short years, Anderson engineered a complete reordering of state government, consolidating 161 agencies, boards, and commissions into 19, and supporting the rewriting and approval of a state constitution that had been in place since 1889. The success of Anderson's political agenda can in part be attributed to the dramatic changes occurring in the nation at large, which reached into Montana during the late 1960s and early 1970s. The 1968 gubernatorial campaign pitted the Republican status quo against the Democratic agent of change, and the Montana electorate overwhelmingly supported change. The changes instituted by Governor Anderson reshaped the political landscape in Montana and continue to resonate today in the state's political institutions and the relationship of the people to their government. Those changes did not happen in a vacuum. It is important to examine the economic, cultural, and political environment of the state leading up to Anderson's election in 1968. Montana's economy has been dominated historically by mining and agriculture, but open pit mining in the Berkeley pit had cut the number of Butte miners in half, and a crippling strike in 1967-68 led to unemployment rates of 49% in Butte. At the same time, the number of Montana farms had shrunk from 41,000 in 1940 to 25,000 in 1969. While the wood products industry doubled the number of jobs from 1945 to 1970, both this industry and the mining industry bumped up against a new environmental awareness and an expanding tourism industry. A former forest ranger for the Bitterroot National Forest, Guy Brandberg, blasted the Forest Service for clear-cutting large tracts of forest south of Missoula, leading to an investigation by the Dean of the University of Montana School of Forestry, Arnold Boley. At the same time, the Horner-Waldorf paper mill in Missoula came under attack by citizens groups for water and air pollution violations. For a century, copper smelting had contributed substantially to the economies of Anaconda and Great Falls, but by the 1960s, the Anaconda Washoe smelter represented the state's worst air polluter, pumping 1,000 tons of sulfur dioxide into the air daily. Another bright spot in the economy, coal mining, became tainted when proposals emerged to burn the coal in Montana to produce electricity for export, creating an unprecedented demand for water, also coveted by eastern Montana ranchers. After almost 2 decades of dominance by the Republican Party, the political power in Montana shifted from rural areas to the cities, in large part due to the 1965 federally imposed reapportionment of the legislature. At the same time, a century of dominating political influence by the Anaconda Company had begun to wane, with the sale of most of Montana's daily newspapers by the company to Lee Enterprises of Iowa in 1959. In addition, Montanans watched from afar the alarming conflict and crisis occurring in American cities, providing them with a renewed appreciation for Montana's exceptional landscape and a small-town neighborliness not found in urban centers on the coasts. By 1963, the baby boomers, ages 15 to 24, represented the largest segment of the American population at 27 million, which translated into a huge boom in college enrollment in Montana. Between 1945 and 1968, the enrollment at Montana State University mushroomed by 600%. Coincidentally, the Montana legislature in the late 1960s looked much younger, better educated, and more independent. For example, in 1965, the voters of Flathead County elected Margaret Scherf, a published mystery writer, to the State House. Scherf saw the legislative process as tedious but necessary, allowing the rural people to get a broader perspective on issues such as education, taxes, and the economy then available to them at the local level. In the gubernatorial election of 1968, this reborn progressivism, reminiscent of the 19-teens in Montana, challenged the status quo of the past 16 years, dominated by tax cuts, budget deficits, and drastic cuts in state services. I might mention that Margaret Scherf had a piece in Harper's Magazine in 1966 about her experiences in Helena working as a legislator, which is very interesting. It's actually, that essay is in this book. Forrest Anderson's life began in Helena, Montana on January 30th, 1913, the son of a Swedish clothing merchant, Oscar, and Irish mother, Nora. Anderson attended high school in Helena and college at the University of Montana in Missoula and the Columbus University Law School in Washington, D.C. Anderson remains the only Montana governor to serve in all branches of government, from legislative to judicial to the executive. At age 30, Anderson ran and was elected to one term, 1943 through 45, as a legislator representing Helena and Lewis and Clark County. In 1947, the people of Lewis and Clark County elected Anderson to serve as their county attorney, and in later years, Anderson spoke proudly about his single term as county attorney, during which not a single juvenile offender was sent to reform school. In 1952, the electorate chose Anderson to serve on the Montana Supreme Court. In 1953, the state legislature enacted a bill by a wide margin to create a legislative council designed to provide lawmakers with objective information on issues before them. However, within months of passage, the law was challenged and found unconstitutional by the state Supreme Court in a 3-2 decision, with Associate Justice Anderson writing the dissent. Anderson wrote, "By broadly construing the restrictions of state constitutions, which in themselves are mid-Victorian in nature, the courts are unduly hamstringing modern legislative processes." 4 years later, House Bill 46 passed again, calling for the creation of a legislative council. But this time the Supreme Court rebuked the challenge, in part due to the persuasive case presented by the new Attorney General, Forrest Anderson, marking the first acknowledgement of Anderson as a government reformer. In 1956, Anderson sought and won the office of Attorney General, where he remained for 12 years. At the end of his political career, Anderson remembered his 3 terms as Attorney General as his best years. Management of the state Montana prison would demand Anderson's attention throughout his term as Attorney General. On July 31st, 1957, decades of neglect erupted in the Deer Lodge prison when 80 prisoners took hostages and presented a list of grievances, including a demand for a federal investigation of the prison. Within 24 hours, Anderson had met with the prisoners, order had been restored, and an investigation of conditions promised. Actually, the first action of the newly created Legislative Council called for a complete review of prison administration and staff. 2 years later, with reform efforts underway and a new warden and deputy warden, a small cadre of inmates took 20 hostages and killed the deputy warden. Governor Aronson called in the National Guard. On April 17, 1959, Attorney General Anderson personally negotiated the release of the hostages. And the governor and the attorney general had been called to the prison and told what the situation was, and the governor just looked at Anderson and said, you know, you have to go in and deal with this. And so Attorney General Anderson went in without any weapons, you know, totally unarmed, and arranged for the release of the hostages. Anderson offered an 8-point program to improve food, exercise, and security, and the inmates capitulated. Over the years, Anderson continued to tout his efforts to improve the penal system, citing the reduction in prison population and recidivism rate, and his success in securing $3.8 million in federal funds for a new prison in 1971. Retired District Court Judge Gordon Bennett, who went to work for Anderson fresh out of law school, remembers being impressed by Anderson's intelligence, confidence, and pragmatism. At the same time, Bennett and others recognized the Attorney General's ongoing battle with alcohol, which he overcame by his second term. Bennett described Anderson's management style as trusting but demanding. He hired a group of talented young professionals to whom he provided a blueprint for action and allowed them the freedom to do their jobs. In 1968, Forrest Anderson saw an opportunity to challenge the status quo and reshape Montana state government, and he felt the time was right. Anderson's decision to run for governor had been influenced by family, his evolution as a politician, and a carefully crafted agenda. According to his son Newell, Forrest felt the children were old enough to withstand the rigors of a campaign and the office. And during his 20 years in politics, Anderson felt he had gained the wisdom and perspective to accomplish a select number of goals, specifically the reorganization of state government. Anderson had spent his entire political career working to make government more accessible and responsive to the average Montanan. Anderson wholeheartedly believed in good government. After 16 years of Republican domination of the governor's office, Montana ranked 47th in the nation in economic growth, and per capita income fell below the national average. At the same time, state government spawned 32 new departments, and state revenues failed to keep pace with government expenditures. Anderson challenged the Republican governor, Tim Babcock, a Billings businessman, with rhetoric right out of the Republican playbook. In campaign literature, candidate Anderson touted economic development, development of natural resources, and the streamlining of state government as a means to making Montana prosper. On taxes, the Democrat called for comprehensive tax reform, and his strong opposition to a 2% sales tax introduced by Babcock during the 1967 legislative session. In fact, Anderson transformed this part of his platform into a catchy slogan: "Pay more, what for?" A poll taken in February 1967 found 70% of respondents opposed to a sales tax. In this case, Montana clearly defied the national trend. Montana remained one of only 5 states in the Union without a sales tax. But the streamlining and efficiency of state government remained at the heart of Anderson's campaign, and another effective slogan emerged: 20's plenty. Anderson's executive reorganization plan meant cutting the unwieldy maze of 161 state agencies, boards, and departments to a maximum of 20. Anderson's plan to reform state government didn't stop with streamlining its bloated profile. The Democratic candidate called for improving the public employee retirement system to attract more qualified employees to state service and to tap into the growing largesse of the federal government to states. In an activist vein, Anderson also proposed simplifying the laws governing state aid to struggling cities. The incumbent Babcock's problems began in the primaries, where his Lieutenant Governor, Ted James, challenged his leadership and the concept of a sales tax. In addition, James gained the support of former governors Aronson, Sam Ford, and party stalwart Wellington Rankin. Even so, Babcock easily defeated James, but a recent shift in the Montana political landscape and national unrest, triggered by the escalation of the war in Vietnam and its attendant campus unrest, along with the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, favored Anderson, an agent of change, in the general election. The sales tax issue meant Babcock's undoing, since he tied his proposed property tax reduction to the approval of a sales tax. On Election Day in November 1968, Anderson defeated Babcock 150,481 to 116,432, the largest vote margin since 1920. Anderson captured 47 of the 56 counties, and Democrats also won majorities in both houses of the legislature. To resolve a prolonged legislative stalemate over revenue in 1971, Anderson and Republican leaders agreed to give voters in November a choice between a new 2% sales tax and lowering the 40% income tax surcharge to 10% or maintaining the 40% income surcharge. Voters in all 56 counties rejected the sales tax and approved the income tax surcharge by the 2-to-1 margin. The backlash against the sales tax also led to the Democratic domination of the Constitutional Convention delegates chosen in 1971. Montana historian Harry Fritz attributed the decline of Republican power in state politics for the next 20 years to the sales tax issue. In addressing the 41st legislature on January 9, 1969, in his first State of the State message, Governor Anderson set the tone for the next 4 years. Anderson said, "We have circled the moon and we have split the atom, but we have failed in Montana and elsewhere to throw off the shackles imposed by 19th century state government organization. We have failed to bring to the job of state government the efficiency which modern technology and advanced thinking make possible." Cognizant of the past 6 failures to remake state government, beginning in 1919, Anderson pleaded for the critical ingredient needed for success: cooperation. Cooperation between the executive and legislative branches, between the Senate and the House, and between the two political parties. Anderson's timing could not have been better, since 15 other states, including Wisconsin, Colorado, Florida, New York, and Oregon, had recently reorganized their state governments or were in the process. The success of the reorganization effort in the early 1970s can be linked indirectly to the long-term educational efforts of the Montana League of Women Voters. In 1962, the League published a booklet entitled Check and Balance, based on the organization's primary tenet to promote the informed and active participation of citizens in government. In the pages of this 24-page booklet, the League pointed out failed historical efforts at streamlining government and the reasons behind these failures. Montana's diverse resources of cattle, copper, wheat, and timber, and the industries they spawned established some of the major tenets of the 1889 Constitution, most significantly the diffusion of executive power. Over the next 8 decades, the multiplication and division of offices, agencies, boards, and commissions created a bureaucratic maze incomprehensible to the average citizen. Historical attempts at reorganization in 1919, 1943, 1953, 1957, 1960, 61, and 1963 each failed due to special interests trumping the interests of the whole. In 1943, Republican Governor Sam Ford sounded the alarm regarding the alarming growth of state offices and the cost of duplicated services in the state address to the legislature, to no avail. Unlike efforts during the past century, the 41st Legislative Assembly acted upon Governor Anderson's request shortly after his message to the legislature on January 1969, and formed the Bipartisan Commission on Executive Reorganization, comprised of 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats, and the governor serving as chairman. Anderson selected Butte native and University of Montana law professor William Duke Crowley to direct the office, and George Boselman, a recent graduate of the Political Science Department at the University of Montana, as Crowley's deputy director. The staff included a group of young, energetic, and idealistic recent university graduates, such as Evan Barrett, Diana Dowling, Sheena Wilson, all of whom would reappear as key players in future state government positions. The task before the newly appointed commission and staff could only be described as monumental. but they remained undeterred. During the next 16 months, they would have to reconfigure a maze of statutory law created by the legislature over the past 80 years to satisfy a wide array of interest groups. In essence, distill 161 administrative offices into 20. By December 1970, the commission staff of 20 drafted 22 research reports spanning 1,800 pages. More importantly, they also drafted a constitutional amendment asking the legislature to reduce the number of executive agencies to no more than 20 by July 1st, 1973. And during this effort, that was the first time that computers were used in a major way in state government, and they were used, by the people trying to rewrite these laws and eliminate these various agencies. They could do keyword searches through this new computer system. The principles upon which the Commission based its recommendations derive from three basic tenets. The governor represents the central executive authority, and the lines of authority and responsibility need to be clearly defined. The Commission then mounted an elaborate information campaign to assure passage to the Constitutional Convention, constitutional amendment by the voters in November 1970 election. Sage Advertising of Helena outlined their media campaign in a letter to George Boselman in August 1970. Sage suggested employing 48 billboards, 8 in Great Falls, Billings, Helena, and Butte, 6 in Missoula, and a total of 10 for Glasgow, Harlem, Chinook, and Havre. All Montana television stations had promised public service ads, while 4 of the stations promised 1/2 hour of prime time to cover the issue, as well as providing equal time for those opposing the amendment. The total cost of television time was $7,750. It's difficult to even imagine these media costs in the 21st century media environment. Sage also proposed bumper stickers, brochures, and buttons with the campaign motto, 20's plenty. Sage offered to produce 150,000 two-color, two-sided, three-panel brochures for $4,250, which would be distributed by the Montana League of Women Voters at shopping centers around the state. And this is one of those brochures. With Anderson's leadership, along with unprecedented support of the legislature and a massive educational campaign orchestrated in part by the Montana League of Women Voters, the amendment to the Constitution calling for a 20-department executive passed by an overwhelming 70% margin in the fall of 1970. Not one Montana county opposed it. During the drafting of the bill for the ballot in the 1969 special session, all 55 senators voted for it and only 5 House Republicans opposed it. The Montana vote did not occur in isolation. It reflected political sentiments nationwide. Between 1967 and 1970, 27 states organized special commissions on executive reorganization, and 20 states had actually reorganized. By June 1970, the Commission on Executive Reorganization had already completed an analysis of the current structure of the executive branch of government and had analyzed each agency's function, cost, and effectiveness, and had begun drafting legislation to present to the 1971 legislature. During that autumn, Governor Anderson hit the road to promote executive reorganization. Speaking to the Montana Chamber of Commerce in Lewistown in October, Anderson criticized the 1889 Constitution for limiting the power of local governance, thus preventing them from responding to local concerns. That same month in Missoula, speaking to the Montana Association of Utilities, Anderson applauded the management skills of American businessmen while denouncing the tools available to the government managers, due in large part to the explosion of state agencies and the diffusion of responsibility. In a speech to the legislature on January 25th, Anderson quoted Republican President Nixon from a speech that could have been written by Anderson himself. Nixon said, "Let's face it, most Americans today are fed up with government at all levels. I have concluded that sweeping reorganizations of the executive branch is needed to keep up with the times and needs of the people." In January 1971, a bill drafted by the Commission staff was submitted to the 42nd Legislative Assembly. Over the next couple of months, the Legislative Committee took testimony from 120 citizens. 38 spoke in favor, and 82 testified against the bill, while 54 proposed amendments. No other bill in recent memory had been revised and amended as much. However, none had ever dealt with issues as complex. So this is a poem that I found in J.D. Holmes' collection. He was a Capitol reporter for a good number of years here in Helena. He says, "I wish I were a sparrow with entrails like a goose, so I could fly around on high with bowels so big and loose. I'd fly right over Helena where one would never know, and when I heard pay more, what for? I'd chirp and let her go." It would be a mistake to assume that the bills introduced in the Montana House and Senate went uncontested. Much of the resistance, as expected, came from the scores of independent boards that faced dissolution. Phyllis McDonald, director of the School of Nursing at St. Patrick's Hospital in Missoula, warned the legislature that tampering with the independence of the State Board of Nursing could be a deterrent to the future of nursing in Montana. Likewise, hearings brought out protests from the State Plumbing Board, the State Hearing Aid Dispensers Board, and the Montana Board of Certified Water and Wastewater Operators, not to mention the State Barbers Board. Although opposition to the bill came from Republicans like House Leader William Mather, Democrats also joined the fray. Democrats like Superintendent of Public Instruction Dolores Kohlberg accused Governor Anderson of putting forth an unconstitutional bill. Anderson had gotten on the wrong side of conservationists even before reorganization efforts began through an ongoing personal battle with Frank Dunkel, the outspoken and popular director of Fish and Game Department, who frequently jousted with governor-appointed Fish and Game Commission. Early in January, the Missoulian editorial page editor Sam Reynolds charged that approving the governor's reorganization plan would set the stage for a dictatorially minded governor to rule the state as if he were Huey Long. 3 of Montana's major newspapers, the Great Falls Tribune, the Missoulian, and the Helena Independent Record, called for further evaluation and to put off reorganization to a special session the following year, fearing the governor could turn the state's civil service system into a spoils system. However, on February 5th, the Commission on Executive Reorganization met to consider a number of amendments proposed at the series of hearings beginning a number of compromises put forth by the Commission staff and accepted by Anderson, making way for an 85-15 House vote approving the Conference Committee report on March 4th, the last day of the session. That same day, the Senate approved the report by a vote of 46-5 with support from Republicans Carl Rostad and Antoinette Roselle, who both served on the bipartisan commission. Late on March 4th, Governor Anderson called a special session in the legislature to complete a budget and finalize details concerning the implementation of the new executive reorganization law, Senate Bill 274, which Anderson signed on March 10th, 1971. The success of the Anderson Initiative for Reorganization can be linked to several factors, most importantly compromise. Anderson and his staff learned from earlier efforts in Colorado, Arkansas, Minnesota, and Arizona. The popular support for the concept, evidenced by the 70% approval of the constitutional amendment on the November 1970 ballot, frequently protected the effort from traditional partisanship. A key point of compromise came with the balance of power created by allowing for watchdog public commissions overseeing policymaking in the departments of health and environment, institutions, natural resources, highways, fish and game, and administration. To counterbalance his appointment of department heads, Anderson also reluctantly accepted amendments to his plan made by House members and by allowing Republican Speaker James Lucas to be heard on the proposal. In the end, both Lucas and Senator Antoinette Roselle, Republican of Billings, supported the legislation, and in fact, Roselle provided the tie-breaking vote to bring the Senate Bill 274 to the floor for a vote. Even after passage of executive reorganization, overturning a half-century of failed attempts, some of the Reorganization Commission staff remained disappointed, feeling that too much had been conceded in the process. The governor's executive assistant, Ron Richards, portrayed the passage of the reorganization bill as the easy part. He said, "Now we're down to the hard part. We must deal with the internal people, not the external ones or legislators. We anticipate a lot of resistance from agencies." When asked about the success of executive reorganization, Sheena Wilson, a recent political science graduate of the University of Montana 40 years ago, marked the effort as an important step forward in making government more relevant to the average person. Wilson, speaking from her experience as Deputy Chief of Staff for Governor Schweitzer from 2004 to 2012, described a government that is more logical in its organization and therefore more accessible and accountable to citizens and voters. According to Wilson, reorganization did not eliminate a myriad of boards and commissions, but at least the interested citizen could find a person to answer their questions. Wilson described all bureaucracies, churches, schools, the military, as being inefficient at times. She said the public often forgets how complicated the world is and how expensive it is to provide services, especially during emergencies. By December 31st, 1972, two of the major goals of reorganization had been accomplished. 19 departments had been activated and 20,000 sections of the Montana laws had been rewritten. And probably one of the most underreported aspects of executive reorganization surfaced, the creation of the Board of Investments. And I've been told by somebody recently that George Bauselman, it was kind of his idea, the Board of Investments. Prior to reorganization, all state revenues resided in every local bank across the state, garnering the state a pitiful 1% interest rate, while the banks loaned the same monies at an 8% rate. This archaic system can be linked to a popular distrust of the state treasurer and centralized power dating from the territorial period. In fact, prior to 1970, over one-half of the state's treasury sat idle in non-bearing interest accounts across the state. In fact, the first year after reorganization, the Montana Trust and Legacy Fund showed a 43% increase in earnings. By January 1972, savings from efficiencies and increases from new investments totaled almost $1.4 million. Today, these investments exceed $13 billion. Efforts at reorganizing the executive branch of state government brought into sharp focus the inadequacy of Montana's 1889 Constitution. In fact, prior to Anderson's election in 1968, the Montana legislature assigned the Legislative Council to the task of evaluating deficiencies in the 77-year-old document. The Council's 1967 report found the current Constitution woefully lacking in the latter half of the 20th century and recommended creation of a Constitutional Revision Commission, which the 1969 legislature established that year. That commission would be composed of 4 senators, 4 representatives, 4 members appointed by the governor, and 4 appointed by the Supreme Court. Ellis Waldron, University of Montana political scientist, provided members of the commission with a historical critique of the current Constitution. In 1889, the 1889 Montana Constitution relied heavily upon a document created by 45 delegates in less than a month and approved by territorial voters in November 1884, intended as a vehicle to statehood but ignored by the U.S. Congress. William A. Clark, Butte Copper King, who presided over both the 1884 and 1889 conventions, inserted significant tax exemptions for mining. It also reflected a general public distrust of both the executive and legislative branches found in numerous frontier constitutions. This 19th century document divided executive power among a myriad of boards and agencies without attaching responsibility to any one authority like the governor. Waldron said, "We want a constitution that clarifies and fixes responsibility for what the government does and allows ordinary people to fix blame for what we don't like." This statement mimics Anderson's primary campaign pledge in his run for governor in 1968. Waldron went on to say that the 1889 Constitution allowed for an oversized, underpowered legislature and an expensive, lumbering system of justice. Waldron implored the commission to create a document for the 20th century, an articulate, clean, sensible framework for government. Waldron warned that failure to modernize the document would frustrate and alienate the citizenry. Waldron's analysis dovetails nicely with Anderson's prescription for reviving state government, but throughout the efforts to rewrite the state's constitution, Anderson remained intent on avoiding the political fray. As early as June 1970, the governor declared his fears related to calling for a constitutional convention, a fear that special interests could subvert the process to their own political ends. Two of Anderson's most trusted advisors, William Crowley and Gordon Bennett, both reiterated Anderson's belief that politics would poison the well, and hence his desire to distance himself from the particulars of the constitutional debate. The commission enlisted a young female historian, Marjorie Brown, to complement the experience of political scientist Waldron and attorneys Bruce Toole of Billings, Alex Blewett of Great Falls, and Ty Robinson of Missoula in analyzing the current Constitution and recommending changes. Brown, enrolled as a PhD candidate in history at the University of Montana, selected the history of the Montana Constitution as her dissertation topic while serving on the Constitution Revision Commission from 1969 to 1971. Throughout her tenure with the Revision Commission and then the Convention Commission, Brown reiterated the importance of a historical perspective in crafting a new Constitution, a basic recognition of the differences between 19th and 20th century Montana society and the role of government in both. Brown also pointed to the most recent political history that gave birth to the 1972 Convention, from the creation of the Legislative Council and the freeing of the Montana press in the late 1950s to another 10 years of constitutional study authorized by the legislature. In short, the gathering of convention delegates in January 1972 emerged out of a recent effort by Montana's citizens to analyze the past and move into the future. The Nonpartisan Constitutional Revision Commission created by the 1971 legislature responded positively to Waldron's plea. Referendum 67 calling for a constitutional convention appeared on the November 1970 ballot, along with two amendments concerned with reducing executive agencies to 20. And this is a brochure that was passed around, and it's pretty striking. I mean, look at the annual state budget in 1889 was 187,000, 1970 to 250 million. So that was a pretty strong statement about what had changed over time. November 19, let's see. It is important to note the factions from opposite ends of the political spectrum supported the call for a constitutional convention, from the Farmers Union to the Montana AFL-CIO to the Montana Chamber of Commerce to the League of Cities and Towns to both political parties. Montana's passed the referendum by a 2-to-1 majority, with all but 5 rural counties voicing their approval. Montana followed 9 other states during the 1960s in their efforts to revise outdated 19th century constitutions. The 42nd Legislative Assembly passed House Bill 168 on March 11, 1971, calling for a primary election of convention delegates for June 1st. The June ballot listed 247 Democrats, 232 Republicans, 32 independents, and 4 new reform candidates. 100 delegates would be chosen in November from the 200 candidates selected in the September primary election. The 1889 Constitution prohibited those currently serving state office from serving as delegates, which was confirmed by a February 19, 1971 Montana Supreme Court decision. But candidates were required to declare a party affiliation. Several factors influenced the choice of delegates and the will to call a convention. 2 U.S. Supreme Court decisions, 1962 and 1964, on legislative reapportionment, which favored urban districts over a rural one person, one vote, and a sales tax referendum that appeared on the ballot associated with the Republican Party and rejected by 70% of Montana voters. On November 2nd, Montana voters selected 58 Democrats, 36 Republicans, and 6 independents to write a new constitution. A diverse group of delegates gathered in Helena on January 17, 1972, none of whom had any experience writing a constitution. This group included slightly more lawyers than ranchers and farmers, 24 versus 20, 19 former legislators, 13 educators, several ministers, a beekeeper, and 3 professors. Women constituted 19 of the 100 delegates, and approximately two-thirds had some prior experience in government. The role of women in the convention was significant. In 1971, only 2 women served in the entire Montana legislature. The average age of delegates was 50, the youngest at age 24 and the oldest at age 72. 55 out of 100 were college educated, a larger percentage of college grads than the legislature. Governor Anderson addressed the opening ceremonies on November 29, 1971, reiterating recurrent themes of his. He said, "You have an opportunity to initiate a new history, a history of dynamic and responsive state government. Montana's present constitution is an expression of the distrust in government that was prevalent when it was written in 1889. It imposes strict limitations on the exercise of the powers of government, legislative, executive, and judicial. You are here to write a constitution, not a body of statutes, and this document must withstand the seasons of history, not just the climate of current opinion." The convention elected Leo Graybill, Jr., a Great Falls attorney and an unsuccessful Democratic candidate for Montana's Eastern Congressional District, to be president of the convention. John Toole, a Republican insurance man from Missoula, became first vice president, followed by Bruce Brown, a Republican attorney from Miles City, and Bozeman Democrat Dorothy Eck and Gene Bowman, a Billings Republican, for secretary. In an effort to diminish partisanship, delegates were seated alphabetically. Leo Graybill, Jr., a Yale-educated attorney with strong Democratic sympathies towards labor unions and the environment, provide a sterling example for his convention compatriots of civility and a willingness to compromise, which became the watchword for the 54-day convention. Graybill reminded the delegates how different Montana looked in 1889 and to contemplate what life would be like 70 years hence in 2040. Graybill acknowledged the difficulty of the task before them and pleaded for their cooperation. "I would simply remind you that we must be open to ideas, open to opinions, open to debate. We must seek guidance and good fellowship right here in this room. If we can make government work here in this room, then perhaps we can make Montana, or help Montana, move into the future with confidence and vision." Graybill skillfully moved some of the more contentious issues off the convention floor into committee, which allowed for greater back and forth between delegates of opposing views. According to the delegates from both sides of the aisle, Graybill took the role of convention president seriously, foregoing his own partisan viewpoint to arbitrate diverging political stances. The Convention Revision Commission, led by Dale Harris, who's here on the right, and Max Baucus was also on this staff, he's standing there on the left, employed several dozen young university-trained political science majors, journalism majors, and attorneys to research issues relevant to the 10 major committees and 4 procedural committees, and ultimately produced 2,300 pages of information related to topics ranging from a Bill of Rights to education, natural resources, and local government. Up front, the delegates decided that all convention deliberations needed to be open to the public. 3 days advance notice would be given for all committee hearings, and debate could not be limited. The unicameral format of the convention allowed for debate and multiple votes on the same issue, sometimes several times during the same day. Actually, one of the most contentious issues arose around the prescribed format of the legislature, bicameral versus unicameral. Ultimately, they agreed to let the public decide this issue through a constitutional referendum placed on the June 1972 ballot, along with 2 other controversial issues, whether to allow the legislature to legalize gambling and the abolition of the death penalty. But the delegates did grapple with a number of other contentious issues surrounding education, the public right to know, protection of the environment, discrimination, and a protection of gun rights. The delegates voted to ban the use of public funds for non-public education and placed governance of the universities in the hands of the Board of Regents in an attempt to avoid direct interference in the legislature in higher education. The convention incurred the wrath of the press in its decision to allow public agencies to conceal facts from the public when demand for individual privacy clearly exceeds the the merits of public disclosure. The delegates faced public pressure to provide constitutional protection of the environment, prompted by a century of corporate mine-related water and air pollution and by a national movement that resulted in the passage of a federal Clean Air Act and the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970 and the Clean Water Act in 1972. While the Natural Resources Committee rejected constitutional articles opening the door to lawsuits against polluters, the delegates inserted Article 9, Section 1. The state and each person shall maintain and improve a clean and healthful environment in Montana for present and future generations, which to this day is the strongest conservation statement in any state constitution. The second section of this article also mandates the reclamation of all disturbed lands paid for by a tax on the extraction of all natural resources. On March 24, 1972, the 100 delegates and other dignitaries, including Governor Forrest Anderson, gathered in the Capitol to sign the 13,200-word document that they created through 10 weeks of serious debate and compromise. The day before, Republican delegate James Garlington of Missoula, one of the state's most prominent lawyers, acknowledged the document's shortcomings while recognizing the effort. Garlington said, "The press has described our work as middle of the road, which I suppose is to imply short-sighted timidity in our judgments. This is a vague value judgment. The truth is that most of the people are in the middle of the road, and the Constitution has to be for most of the people. Derived as it is from the imperfect workings of imperfect people, it certainly has its faults." President Graybill praised the work of his fellow 99 delegates, but urged them to take up the hard work of gaining ratification by the Montana electorate. Governor Anderson echoed that sentiment. If you had the courage to make the changes that were necessary and the wisdom to avoid those that were not, Montanans will approve this Constitution. Your work is not over, however, and each of you must go out and sell this document between now and June 6th. Another reflection of cultural forces outside Montana impacting the Constitution can be found in Article 10, Section 1, which acknowledges the responsibility of public education to help preserve the cultural integrity of the American Indians by teaching about Native American culture in Montana schools. Reverend William Burkhart, who was minister at the Plymouth Congregational Church, served on the Education Committee, documented his reaction to pleas by Native Americans to his committee. Indian leaders are impressive in their resolve to see their people find relevance in the educational process. A week before signing the new Constitution, Burkhart recorded his feelings about teaching Native American traditions and life in his diary. Somehow a tumble of feelings catches in heart and throat as the last 100 years flash by in memory. Deliberate government policies aimed at destroying a culture and its people. How do you put back the spirit of a broken people? How do you erase the bitterness? This action by the constitutional delegates cannot be seen in isolation from national events surrounding the emergence of the American Indian Movement, AIM, in Minneapolis in 1968, and protests by that group during 1970 through 72. The passage of Executive Reorganization Amendment and the drafting of a new Constitution by a diverse group of delegates representing all political persuasions did not happen in a vacuum, nor would it be approved by voters without a struggle. As the convention adjourned, delegates returned to their homes prepared to educate their constituents about the value of the newly drafted document. The Constitution Revision Commission had planned to spend $45,000 of convention appropriation on public education. However, on April 21st, 1972, the Montana Supreme Court prohibited the use of public funds for this purpose, claiming the delegates had exhausted their authority upon adjournment in March. A number of delegates quickly organized Citizens for Constitutional Improvement with help from the Montana League of Women Voters, labor educational leaders, environmentalists, and some business groups. They raised $10,000 to get the word out. The convention mailed a 24-page guide to all registered voters to explain the major aspects of the new Constitution. Opponents of the new Constitution, led by the Farm Bureau Federation, the Taxpayers Association, and some ranchers, organized the Citizens for Constitutional Government and spent $20,000 opposing much of the reform proposed. Both the Great Falls Tribune and the Missoulian endorsed ratification, while the Butte Standard and the Billings Gazette took no position. On June 6, 1972, Montana voters spoke, approving the new Constitution by a razor-thin margin of 2,532 votes. Convention staff attributed the close vote to the complexity of the issues for the average voter and the inherent difficulty with a change of this magnitude. Regional demographics told the story. 12 urban counties approved, while 45 rural counties opposed the new Constitution. Montana voters also approved constitutional referendums to legalize gambling and retain the death penalty, but opposed the creation of a unicameral legislature. Opponents of the new Constitution immediately challenged the results on the grounds that a majority of those who voted the ballot did not endorse the Constitution. A total of 237,600 voters cast ballots on the various constitutional referendums. However, the 230,298 that approved the Constitution falls 2,386 short of the 50% of the total votes cast. On June 20th, 1972, Governor Anderson quickly signed a proclamation of ratification of the Constitution, hoping to head off the opponents, led by Secretary of State Frank Murray and the Montana Farm Bureau Federation, who sought an injunction against the ratification in the state Supreme Court. Anderson had anticipated a judicial challenge or an injunction and told his legal counsel Crowley to get the proclamation ready for his signature, awaiting the final tallies from the Board of Election Commissioners. Drama ensued when Secretary of State Murray claimed he didn't see the governor sign the proclamation. Anderson then said, "Frank, I'm going to sign this again. Frank, are you watching me? I'm writing, Frank. Now, Mr. Secretary of State, attest to my approval of this document. This is your legal duty." The governor then signed the proclamation a second time. The rift between Anderson and Murray dated back to the executive reorganization debate, during which Murray publicly referred to Anderson as Hitler or Mussolini, a governor intent on establishing dictatorial powers within the governor's office. On August 18, 1972, the Montana Supreme Court, in a 3-2 decision, rejected the challenge mounted by opponents, ruling the Constitution vote valid, and both the federal district court and the U.S. Supreme Court concurred in subsequent lawsuits. The approval of the new Constitution by Montana voters in 1972 places the state in rarefied company nationally. Only 7 states revised their constitutions between 1965 and 1974, while 9 states rejected new constitutions, including North Dakota. Montana's document remains one of the shortest in length, but one of the most critically acclaimed. The new Constitution has been held up as a model document by other states and nations because of its nonpartisan populist nature. In the Declaration of Rights, the delegates crafted language declaring a citizen's right to privacy, a right to observe and participate in government, a right to a clean and healthy environment, a right to local government review, and equality under the law regardless of age, race, or sex. According to critics, the weakest part of the new Constitution remains the failure to reshape the judiciary. Most importantly, the failure to establish a unified state court structure and a merit system for selecting judges. Nevertheless, Montanans seem satisfied with the new Constitution, rejecting by a 3/4 majority a call for a new convention in 1990, and the fact that the Constitution has only been amended 21 times since 1972. After 40 years, the Montana Constitution remains in place, with much of the initial opposition fading over time. When voters of Montana narrowly approved the new Constitution in 1972, the national press heralded the event by calling the document a model for the world. How does the effort stack up in the 21st century? In the spring of 2012, the Center for Public Integrity evaluated all 50 states for integrity in state government, and Montana received a D+ ranking, 27th out of 50. According to Dennis Swibel, a University of Montana journalism professor and author of The Copper Chorus, Mining Politics in the Montana Press, said, despite a reputation for open government, Montana has ambiguous ethics laws, weak disclosure disclosure requirements and inconsistent enforcement. As author of the Montana Study, Swibel noted the following grades for Montana: an F in public access to information, C+ in executive accountability, a D in political financing, and an F in lobbying disclosure. At the time, Rich Bechtel, who oversaw the Legislative Committee on the Convention Commission in 1972, pointed to the enduring legacy of the Declaration of Rights drafted in the new Constitution. According to Bechtel, the 1960s through the 1970s ushered in a renaissance of public participation in government at all levels. At the same time, he noted the difficulty of sustaining public interest in lawmaking, in contrast to corporate America, which has the financial means to participate in the lawmaking process from beginning to end. From Bechtel's perspective, the delegates took the long view over the parochial partisan view, resulting in a provision in the Declaration of Rights guaranteeing local government review every 10 years. Bechtel, along with a number of the principals that took part in the Constitutional Convention, attributed the success of the convention to both the honest debate, willingness to listen, and the respect for colleagues, and the hard work and strategic genius of Dale Harris, who headed up both the Constitutional Revision Commission and the Convention Commission. Harris sought out the strongest arguments from each point of view and then allowed members of each committee to debate the merits of each prior to the floor debate of the whole. Forrest Anderson's decision not to interject himself into the debate and to remain on the sidelines demonstrated his political skill and knowledge, ultimately leading to its passage. After a half-century of struggle to rein in exploding state government bureaucracy and 7 decades of effort to amend an outdated state constitution, in 4 short years, Forrest Anderson, with the assistance of dozens of intelligently and politically savvy staff, reshaped the landscape in Helena. However, in the face of these extraordinary political accomplishments, the consummate Montana politician announced he would not run for re-election on October 15, 1971. For his entire term in office, Forrest Anderson had been plagued by serious health problems. How did Governor Anderson accomplish the ever-elusive task of completely reconfiguring a state government allowed to spread like noxious weeds since its birth in 1889? Alec Hansen, Anderson's young press secretary and for the past 2 decades the executive director of the Montana League of Cities and Towns, described Anderson as the smartest guy I ever met in government. According to Hansen, he looked like a winner, he acted like one. In a period of great uncertainty and flux, Hansen cited the importance of that attribute and aura of self-confidence. In fact, Hansen and other members of the staff referred to Anderson as the Silver Fox. An example of Anderson's bigger-than-life personality and wit emerged in his oft-told anecdote involving an exchange between the governor and a publicist for the Montana filmed movie with Dustin Hoffman, Little Big Man. In 1970, the publicist asked Anderson to declare a Little Big Man Day in Montana, to which Anderson, who stood at only 5 foot 4 inches tall, replied to his staff, "You tell that phony Hollywood son of a bitch that every day is a Little Big Man Day in Montana." For most of Montana's 123 years as a state, its governors have not been significant players in the state's development. How does Forrest Anderson rank in the pantheon of 20th century Montana governors? William Duke Crowley, who headed up Anderson's reorganization team and advised the governor on the constitutional rewrite, called Anderson the best person-to-person politician I ever saw, based in large part on the governor's decision to avoid direct participation in the constitutional debate. Crowley added he will undoubtedly prove to be one of the most important Montana governors of the 20th century. Forrest Anderson's success as governor can be attributed to both the character of the Montana electorate and Anderson's personal strategy for success. The politics of Montana have been forged with a good dose of populism, derived from its role as a provider of raw materials, cattle, wheat, copper, timber, coal, and oil, to the nation and to the world, and the impact of the exploitation of those resources on the people. In its brief history, the sparsely populated state has produced some of the nation's iconic politicians: Thomas Walsh, Jeanette Rankin, Joseph Dixon, Burton K. Wheeler, Mike Mansfield, Lee Metcalf, and Forrest Anderson. A willingness to compromise provided the intellectual foundation of Anderson's lengthy political career beginning in 1947. In each segment of his political career, spanning 25 years, Anderson looked to what's possible, preferring the results of direct action over political grandstanding. Anderson demonstrated again and again to be a profound judge of character and a steadfast supporter of those he trusted with the mechanics of everyday operations. Although Forrest Anderson served only one term as governor, his ideas and initiatives continue to reverberate into the 21st century. Thank you.